Take a good look at this locomotive. A long hood at the front, almost 17 meters long, weighing 124 tons, and powered by a 1,000 horsepower engine. And on the nose, a red metal star with the face of Stalin engraved in the center. This is the TE1. And if you think you've seen this design somewhere before, you're right. Because underneath the Soviet paint, this machine is bolt by bolt an American locomotive. For years, propaganda in Moscow pointed the finger at the imperialists on the other side of the Atlantic. At the very same time, in the workshops of Kharkiv, an entire team of Soviet engineers was taking apart, measuring, and copying, piece by piece, a diesel locomotive built by ALCO. What really happened? How did the first major diesel locomotive of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics come from an American design? And why was that story hidden so carefully?
In the 1920s and 1930s, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics even tried to build its own diesel locomotives. There were prototypes and a few experimental designs, but nothing went beyond that. The most ambitious series of those years, EEL, did not even reach 50 units before production was halted in 1941. And after that, nothing. Not a single new mainline diesel locomotive left a Soviet factory during the entire war. At the same time, here in the United States, the railroad industry was making a giant leap forward. In the early 1940s, ALCO developed the RS-1 for the United States Army, a 1,000 horsepower diesel locomotive with electric transmission. In 1941, the six-axle version appeared, the RSD-1, which was essentially the same locomotive with one extra pair of powered wheels and the very same engine, without any increase in horsepower.
In 1942, as the Allies needed to supply the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics through the Persian Corridor, the Americans sent hundreds of locomotives to Iran to transport military equipment to the Soviet border. Many of those locomotives were ALCO RSD-1 units. Then, in 1945, the Soviets officially received 68 ALCO RSD-1 locomotives through the Lend-Lease program. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they were classified as the DA series, originally known as DA-20. But it was in July of 1945, during the preparations for the official train that would take Stalin to the Potsdam Conference, that the story took a different turn. The original plan called for steam locomotives to haul the official train. But after Mozhaisk, the steam locomotive at the front began to lose traction on an uphill grade. At the station of Drovnino, it was decided to replace it, and the locomotive chosen to finish the journey was a DA, specifically DA-2027.
Once inside German territory, Stalin walked over to the locomotive and spoke with the engineer, Victor Leon, who assured him that the locomotive rode smoothly without the jolts typical of steam engines and without the constant stops needed to refill water. That opinion was remembered. A few days later, on August 5, 1945, during Railway Workers' Day, Stalin met with the People's Commissar of Railways, Ivan Kovaliev. It was during that meeting that the decision was made. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would once again build mainline diesel locomotives, and the model to be copied would be the very American locomotive that had impressed him on the way to the Potsdam Conference.
The task of turning the DA-20 into a Soviet locomotive was assigned to the Railway Equipment Factory in Kharkiv. Much of the work was, in essence, a technical translation. The American locomotive used inches, while the Soviet version needed millimeters. The Westinghouse braking system was replaced with the Soviet Matrosov system.
The battery capacity was increased from 360 to 550 amp-hours. The weight increased slightly from about 121 tons to nearly 124 tons. And after a certain production number, even the wheel diameter was changed from 1,016 millimeters to 1,050 millimeters. But the heart of the machine, a 6-cylinder diesel engine producing about 1,000 horsepower with electric transmission, remained almost completely faithful to the original American design. On the outside, the resemblance was even more striking. It had the same wide cab with a rounded roof at one end, followed by the same long and narrow body. And at the front, there was one detail that still fuels discussions in railroad and model railway clubs today: a mounting bracket for a red metal star with the portrait of Stalin engraved in the center, a detail that the original DA never had. In March of 1947, the first unit rolled out of the Kharkiv factory. It was originally named TE1 20. The letter T stood for TE1, meaning diesel locomotive. The letter E stood for electric transmission, and 20 referred to the 20-ton axle load. Very quickly, the name was shortened to simply TE1. Between 1947 and 1950, about 300 units were built, including a small variant called TE5. Only 2 to 5 units were produced. It was designed for extremely cold climates, with an extended cab that enclosed the entire engine and a heating system that kept everything operational even when the engine was turned off. There was also a curious and little-known experiment. 16 TE1 locomotives were converted to operate with a gas generator, powered by a mixture of diesel fuel and anthracite instead of pure liquid fuel. It was an attempt to save petroleum in a union of Soviet Socialist republics that in the early 1950s still had limited fuel reserves. Technically, the experiment worked, reducing diesel fuel consumption to less than half. But the coal dust corroded the pipes and wore out the engine much faster than expected, and the project was abandoned by the end of the decade.
In 1950, the factory in Kharkiv simply stopped building the TE1 and switched to producing the more powerful TE2. It was not because of a technical failure or a serious accident. It was because 1,000 horsepower was no longer enough for what the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics needed. The heaviest steam locomotives, such as the FD and IS classes, were still hauling trains that neither the TE1 nor the TE2 could replace on their own. Only years later, with the arrival of the TE3 in 1956, featuring 2 sections and much more powerful engines, did steam really begin to lose ground on the non-electrified railway lines of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics needed. And its legacy extended far beyond the locomotive itself. The technical foundation of the TE1 would later influence the development of the TEM1 and TEM2 switching locomotives, families that at their core can still trace their origins back to that engine and that electric transmission copied from an American locomotive in 1945, and whose direct descendants are still being built today. And what about you? Had you ever heard of the TE1 before? Or did you think the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had built everything completely on its own, from scratch, every single time? Leave a comment below and let me know what you thought of this video. That's it for this video. A big thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.